Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that sounds like it should be glorious, but is anything but. What was it really like to be a Roman legionary? So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. When you're not marching, you're training. And it is relentless. You practice formations, charge at wooden posts, and engage in mock battles with weapons twice the weight of your actual gear. The goal is to make combat feel easy by comparison, but the process is designed to break you down completely. The journey of the James Caird is a legend of seamanship. For 16 days, Shackleton and his 5 companions battled hurricane-force winds and monstrous waves, some of which they called graybeards, that threatened to swamp their tiny open boat at any moment. They were constantly bailing water and breaking ice off the rigging to prevent the boat from capsizing. They navigated by sextant, catching fleeting glimpses of the sun. In a final, terrifying storm, they were nearly lost, but somehow, battered and exhausted, they made landfall on the unoccupied southern coast of South Georgia. But even then, they weren't safe. The whaling stations were on the other side of the island. Between them and rescue lay a treacherous, unmapped mountain range and glaciers, a landscape that had never been crossed by man. Weakened by their voyage, with only a length of rope and a carpenter's adze for an ice axe, Shackleton and 2 of the other men, Tom Crean and Frank Worsley, set out on a non-stop 36-hour trek across the island's frozen spine. Against all odds, they stumbled into the Stromness whaling station, their faces blackened by frostbite, their clothes in rags, looking more like wild men than celebrated explorers. The whalers were stunned. They had long since given up the Endurance and its crew for dead. After securing the rescue of the 3 men left on the other side of South Georgia, Shackleton's focus immediately returned to the 22 men he had left behind on Elephant Island. He immediately began trying to find a ship to go back for them. It took 3 attempts, thwarted by the impenetrable winter ice pack, but Shackleton refused to give up. Finally, on his 4th try, aboard a small Chilean steam tug called the Yelcho, he broke through. On August 30th, 1916, 4.5 months after he had left, Shackleton sailed into the bay at Elephant Island. The men on shore, who had survived on a diet of penguins and seals, saw the ship and scrambled down to the beach, screaming with joy. Shackleton, standing on the bow, yelled out, "Are you all well?" The answer came back across the water. "All well, boss." He had done it. He hadn't crossed the continent, but he had brought every single man from the main party through a 2-year ordeal in the harshest environment on Earth, and brought them all home alive. The story of Shackleton and the Endurance is the ultimate tale of leadership and resilience. His unwavering optimism, his meticulous attention to the morale of his men, and his sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat in the face of impossible odds are what saved them. In an era defined by the senseless slaughter of the First World War, where millions were lost due to the failures of leadership, Shackleton's quiet, determined triumph, saving all 28 of his men, stands as a powerful and enduring counterpoint. It's a story not of what was lost, but of what, against all probability, was saved. Now let's step away from the stark, dramatic landscapes of human survival and into a world of intricate beauty, quiet revolution, and industrial espionage. We're going to explore the history of something that many of us interact with every day, yet rarely consider: porcelain. This delicate, translucent, and incredibly strong ceramic was, for centuries, a secret known only to China. The quest to unlock that secret drove alchemists, obsessed kings and spies, and its eventual discovery in Europe would change the worlds of art, dining, and global trade forever. It's the story of the hunt for white gold. For over 1,000 years, China was the sole producer of true porcelain. Developed during the Tang Dynasty around the 7th century, Chinese porcelain was unlike any other ceramic in the world. It was made from a special white clay called kaolin, mixed with a feldspar-rich stone called pethence, and fired at extremely high temperatures, over 1,300 degrees Celsius. This process vitrified the clay, making it non-porous, hard as stone, and giving it a delicate, bell-like ring when tapped. To the rest of the world, which only had access to coarse, porous earthenware, Chinese porcelain seemed magical. When porcelain first began to arrive in Europe via the Silk Road, and later, by sea, it caused a sensation. It was incredibly rare and fantastically expensive. a luxury item coveted by kings, popes, and the wealthiest aristocrats. Owning a single Ming Dynasty vase was the ultimate status symbol, a demonstration of immense wealth and refined taste. Europeans called it quote, 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 and they desperately wanted to know how to make it. But the Chinese guarded the secret of its production jealously. The exact formula and the specific firing techniques were a state secret, the key to a hugely profitable monopoly. For centuries, European potters tried and failed to replicate it. They tried mixing all sorts of clays, ground glass and bone ash, but they could never achieve the hardness and translucence of the real thing. Their creations, known as soft paste porcelain or faience, were beautiful in their own right, but they were fragile and chipped easily. They were imitations, not true porcelain. The quest became an obsession, a kind of ceramic holy grail, especially in the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, when solving this mystery became a matter of national prestige. The breakthrough finally came in Germany, thanks to the patronage of a particularly obsessed ruler, Augustus the Strong, the Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. Augustus had a pathological obsession with porcelain, a condition known as maladie de porcelaine. He spent a fortune collecting Chinese and Japanese pieces, nearly bankrupting his kingdom in the process. He famously traded a regiment of 600 soldiers to the King of Prussia in exchange for 151 porcelain vases. He was determined to discover the secret and create his own porcelain factory, and he believed the key lay in alchemy. And at the end of every single day's march, no matter how exhausted you are, you don't rest. You build a fortified camp. You dig a trench, erect a palisade, and lay out the streets of a miniature temporary city. Every single night. It was a marvel of Roman engineering. But for you, it was just back-breaking manual labor. To this end, Augustus effectively imprisoned a young alchemist named Johann Friedrich Böttger. Böttger had foolishly boasted that he could create gold from base metals. Augustus locked him in a laboratory in a castle in Dresden and ordered him to make gold. When Böttger inevitably failed to produce gold, his patron, perhaps seeing a connection between white gold and the yellow kind, changed his assignment. Forget the gold, make me porcelain. Böttger, working with the scientist Ehrenfried Walther von Tschirnhaus, began a long and arduous process of experimentation. After years of frustrating failures, they finally had their breakthrough in 1708. The key was not some secret alchemical formula, but geology. They discovered a local source of pure white clay near the town of Meissen. It was kaolin, the essential ingredient they had been missing. They also figured out the correct, incredibly high firing temperatures needed to vitrify it. Böttger had done it. He had unlocked the secret of true or hard paste porcelain. He had finally made his gold for Augustus. Augustus the Strong was ecstatic. In 1710, he established the Royal Saxon Porcelain Manufactory in a fortress in the town of Meissen to protect the new secret. Böttger and the other artisans were effectively prisoners, sworn to secrecy on pain of death. The Meissen factory began producing exquisite porcelain figurines, tableware, and vases in a European style, which quickly became the new must-have luxury item for the courts of Europe. To mark their work and protect against forgeries, they introduced the famous crossed swords trademark, one of the oldest trademarks still in use today. Of course, a secret this valuable couldn't be kept for long. The history of European porcelain in the 18th century is a story of industrial espionage. Workers from Meissen were bribed and lured away to other courts, taking the, quote, arcanum, or secret knowledge, with them. Soon, rival porcelain factories sprang up in Vienna, Sèvres in France, and eventually across Europe. Each factory developed its own unique style. Sèvres, under the patronage of Madame de Pompadour and King Louis XV, became famous for its rich colors and opulent, gilded designs, while English factories like Wedgwood developed their own distinct, more neoclassical styles. The invention of European porcelain had a profound cultural impact. It transformed dining habits among the wealthy. Instead of eating off pewter or silver plates, the aristocracy could now dine on delicate, beautifully decorated porcelain services. The, quote, dinner set was born. It also created a new art form. The porcelain figurine, depicting everything from classical gods to charming pastoral scenes, became a staple of the Rococo interior. Porcelain wasn't just a material. It was a canvas for the artistic tastes of the age. The story of porcelain is a perfect microcosm of global history. It's a story of art, technology, and trade. It begins as a closely guarded secret from the East, becomes an object of obsessive desire in the West, and is finally cracked through a combination of royal ambition, scientific experimentation, and a healthy dose of luck. It's a reminder that behind the beautiful, delicate objects we might see in a museum, there is often a dramatic story of human ingenuity, greed, and the relentless quest to possess a thing of beauty. Let's now leave the refined world of porcelain and venture into a story that is grittier, darker, and deeply embedded in the folklore of the sea. We're going to explore the legend of the Flying Dutchman. It's more than just a ghost story. It's a powerful maritime myth that speaks to the deepest fears of sailors, the terror of the storm, the loneliness of the open ocean, and the dread of being lost at sea forever. It's a tale that has haunted the imaginations of seafarers for centuries, a symbol of eternal, restless damnation. The core of the legend is simple and stark. The Flying Dutchman is a phantom ship, doomed to sail the oceans for eternity, never able to make port. It is most often sighted off the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, a notoriously treacherous stretch of water where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet, known for its sudden, violent storms. Seeing the Dutchman is considered a terrible omen, a harbinger of doom for the vessel that spots her. The ghost ship often appears in the midst of a storm, glowing with an eerie spectral light, her crew of ghosts frantically trying to get a message to shore. The captain of this cursed vessel is usually identified as a 17th century Dutchman named Hendrik van der Decken, or sometimes just Davy Jones in early versions. The story of his sin varies, but it always involves an act of supreme hubris and blasphemy. The most common version of the tale claims that Captain van der Decken was determined to round the Cape of Good Hope during a ferocious storm. As his crew begged him to turn back, he lashed himself to the wheel, laughing in the face of the tempest, and swore a profane oath that he would round the Cape even if he had to sail until Judgment Day. For this act of defiance against God and nature, his wish was granted, but as a curse. An angel or the devil himself appeared and condemned him to do just that, to sail the seas forever with a ghostly crew of dead men, bringing misfortune to all who sighted him. He is doomed to an eternity of struggle, forever battling the storm, forever trying to round the cape he could never conquer. He is a symbol of man's futile struggle against the power of the elements and the consequences of unbridled arrogance. Let's talk about the food. It's less cuisine and more fuel, motion, of wheat. You're given a ration of wheat, which you have to grind yourself to make a dense, joyless hardtack biscuit. This is supplemented with some bacon, cheese, and pasca, a sour wine mixed with water that was more for killing bacteria than for pleasure. While the story sounds like pure folklore, sightings of the Flying Dutchman have been surprisingly common and have been reported by credible witnesses. In 1881, the future King George V of the United Kingdom, then a young midshipman aboard the HMS Bacchante, recorded a sighting in his official log. He described a phantom brig, glowing with a strange red light, that passed close by their ship in the pre-dawn hours. The lookout who first spotted it was sent up the mast, but he fell to his death just a few hours later, seemingly fulfilling the ship's role as a bad omen. So what could be behind these sightings? Science offers a plausible, if less romantic, explanation: a superior mirage, a specific type of optical illusion known as a fata morgana. This phenomenon occurs when there is a strong temperature inversion, with a layer of cold air sitting just above the sea's surface and a layer of warmer air above it. This acts like a refracting lens, bending light rays and projecting a distorted, shimmering, and often inverted image of a distant object, like a ship that is actually over the horizon. To a sailor on a rolling deck in a storm, such a strange, silent, and glowing apparition would look exactly like a ghost ship. The legend also taps into deep-seated psychological fears. For a sailor in the age of sail, being lost at sea was a very real and terrifying possibility. A long voyage could feel like a kind of purgatory, a state of being disconnected from the living world. The Flying Dutchman gives a name and a narrative to this existential dread. The crew of the ghost ship represents the souls of all the men lost to the sea, forever trapped between worlds, unable to find peace or return home. The story is a powerful expression of the anxieties that came with a life spent at the mercy of the ocean. The myth became so pervasive that it sailed out of sailors, folklore, and into mainstream culture. It was famously adapted into an opera by Richard Wagner in 1843, which tells a more romantic version of the story where the captain can find redemption through the love of a faithful woman. The story has appeared in countless books, poems, and, more recently, films, becoming a permanent fixture in our gallery of maritime legends. It stands alongside tales of mermaids, krakens, and sirens as one of the great archetypal stories of the sea. The enduring power of the Flying Dutchman legend lies in its combination of a thrilling ghost story, a moral cautionary tale, and a possible basis in a real natural phenomenon. It's a perfect storm of narrative elements. It warns against hubris, it gives form to the sailor's deepest anxieties, and it provides a supernatural explanation for a genuinely spooky optical illusion. It reminds us that for most of human history, the ocean was a vast, mysterious, and terrifying place, and sailors populated its emptiness with stories to make sense of its dangers and to give voice to their fears of not making it home. Now let's turn our attention from a ship doomed never to find land to a group of people who were defined by their lack of a homeland and whose name has become synonymous with persecution and resilience. We will explore the long and complex history of the Romani people, often known by the exonym Gypsies. Their story is one of a mysterious origin, a nomadic lifestyle, centuries of misunderstanding and persecution across Europe, and the remarkable survival of a unique and vibrant culture against all odds. The origins of the Romani people were a mystery for centuries. When they first appeared in Europe in the late Middle Ages, their dark skin and unfamiliar language led to wild speculation. Europeans called them gypsies because they mistakenly believed they came from Egypt. Some Romani even encouraged this belief, claiming to be Egyptian pilgrims doing penance, as it afforded them better treatment. It wasn't until the late 18th century that linguistic analysis provided the real answer. Scholars discovered that the Romani language was closely related to Sanskrit and other languages of the Indian subcontinent. The evidence is now clear. The ancestors of the Romani people were various groups who migrated out of northern India over 1,000 years ago, around 1000 CE. The exact reasons for this migration are still debated. It may have been due to invasion, famine, or recruitment as soldiers or artisans, but it began a long, slow journey westward. They traveled through Persia, the Byzantine Empire, and into the Balkans, absorbing words, customs, and musical influences from the cultures they passed through, all while maintaining their own distinct language and identity. By the 15th century, the Romani had arrived in Western Europe. Initially, they were often met with curiosity and a degree of tolerance. They were skilled metalworkers, horse traders, and entertainers, and their perceived exoticism was intriguing. However, this welcome soon soured. As their nomadic lifestyle clashed with the increasingly settled, land-based feudal societies of Europe, suspicion and hostility grew. They were outsiders who didn't fit into the established social order of lord, peasant, and clergy. They had no land, swore fealty to no king, and often practiced their own distinct spiritual beliefs. This suspicion quickly curdled into outright persecution. The Romani were accused of all manner of crimes: theft, kidnapping, witchcraft, and spying for the Ottoman Turks. Their nomadic nature made them easy scapegoats for local problems. Governments across Europe began to enact harsh anti-Romani laws. They were subject to forced assimilation, expulsion, and enslavement. In the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, modern-day Romania, the Romani were held in slavery for 500 years, a brutal period of their history that only ended in the mid-19th century. Discipline is absolute and brutally enforced by your centurion. He's a career soldier who rose from the ranks, and his symbol of office is the vitus, a staff cut from a grapevine. He uses it freely and frequently to correct any legionary who is slow, clumsy, or insubordinate. Your life is governed by his whims. In Western Europe, policies of expulsion were common. Spain, England, France, and various German states all passed laws ordering the Romani to leave their territories on pain of death. These edicts were often impossible to obey, as neighboring territories had similar laws, effectively trapping the Romani in a continent where their very existence was criminalized. This constant threat of violence and expulsion reinforced their nomadic lifestyle and their reliance on close-knit family groups, or companias, for survival. Their social structure became a defense mechanism against a hostile world. Despite the relentless persecution, Romani culture not only survived, but flourished in its own way. Music is perhaps their most famous cultural contribution. The passionate, soulful style of flamenco music in Spain is deeply indebted to the gitanos, the Romani people of Andalusia. The vibrant string music of Eastern Europe and the gypsy jazz style pioneered by the great guitarist Django Reinhardt, a Manouche Romani, have all had a profound impact on the world's musical landscape. Their culture, passed down orally through generations, is rich in storytelling, dance, and a complex system of social and purity laws known as Romanipen. The long history of persecution reached its horrifying apex in the 20th century during the Holocaust. The Nazis, under their twisted racial ideology, deemed the Romani to be racially inferior and a, quote, social menace. They were systematically targeted for extermination in a genocide that the Romani call the porajmos, or the devouring. It is estimated that between 250,000 and 500,000 Romani people were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators, a devastating blow that wiped out a significant portion of the entire European Romani population. Even after the Second World War, discrimination did not end. In many countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, the Romani continued to face systemic racism, segregation, poverty, and police brutality. Forced sterilizations of Romani women occurred in some countries into the late 20th century. Today, the Romani people remain one of Europe's largest and most disadvantaged ethnic minorities. The stereotypes and prejudices that have shadowed them for centuries, of criminality and untrustworthiness, are still deeply entrenched in many societies. The history of the Romani people is a difficult but important one. It's a story that challenges our notions of nationhood, identity, and belonging. For 1,000 years, they have lived as a people without a state, a nation defined not by borders, but by a shared language, culture, and a collective memory of migration and persecution. Their story is a stark testament to the human capacity for prejudice against those who are different. But it is also an incredible story of cultural resilience, adaptation, and survival in the face of unimaginable hardship. Let's now move from the history of a people to the history of a place, a single building that has become an icon of romance, revolution, and brutal injustice. We're going to explore the story of the Bastille. Today, the name evokes images of the French Revolution and the storming of a grim fortress. But the Bastille was much more than just a prison. Its history mirrors the changing fortunes of Paris itself, evolving from a medieval fortress to a symbol of royal tyranny, and finally, to a ghost that haunts the heart of the city. The Bastille began its life not as a prison, but as a fortress. Its construction started in 1370 during the Hundred Years' War. It was built to defend the eastern gate of Paris, the Porte Saint-Antoine, against English attack. With its 8 imposing stone towers, massive walls, and surrounding moat, it was a formidable piece of medieval military architecture, a symbol of royal power designed to protect the city. For its first few centuries, its primary role was defensive, a silent stone guardian on the edge of the capital. It was under the reign of King Louis XIII in the 17th century that the Bastille's function began to shift decisively. Cardinal Richelieu, the king's powerful chief minister, began using the fortress as a state prison. It wasn't for common criminals. Paris had plenty of other jails for them. The Bastille was reserved for a more specific clientele: political prisoners, troublesome aristocrats, religious heretics, and writers who had offended the king or his court. It became a tool of royal absolutism, a place where people could be imprisoned without trial, by the king's direct order alone. The instrument of this imprisonment was the infamous lettre de cachet, or letter of the signet. This was a warrant signed by the king that allowed for the immediate arrest and indefinite detention of an individual without any legal process. There was no charge, no trial, no appeal. A person could simply vanish from the streets of Paris and reappear inside the walls of the Bastille, their fate entirely in the hands of the monarch. This made the Bastille a potent symbol of the arbitrary and unchecked power of the French crown. Despite its fearsome reputation, life inside the Bastille for many of its prisoners, particularly the wealthy ones, was not always one of squalor and torture. Aristocratic prisoners were often held in relative comfort, allowed to bring their own furniture, books, and even their servants. The Marquis de Sade famously wrote some of his most scandalous works while imprisoned there. The great writer Voltaire was a guest of the Bastille on two separate occasions for writing satirical verses critical of the nobility. For the upper classes, it was often more of a luxurious, if involuntary, extended stay. And for serious offenses, the punishments are terrifying. Flogging is common. But for cowardice or mutiny, a unit could be subjected to decimation. 1 in every 10 men, chosen by lot, would be beaten to death by the other 9. It was a viciously effective way to ensure that you feared your own officers more than you feared the enemy. However, for less privileged prisoners, or for those who fell out of favor with the governor, conditions could be grim. The lower dungeons were dark, damp, and infested with vermin. And while tales of elaborate torture devices were largely exaggerated by revolutionary propaganda, the psychological torture of indefinite confinement and complete uncertainty was very real. The most famous prisoner, the Man in the Iron Mask, a mysterious individual held for decades whose identity has never been confirmed, epitomized the terrifying secrecy and absolute power the Bastille represented. By the late 18th century, the Bastille had become a powerful symbol of royal despotism in the popular imagination. It was seen as the physical embodiment of the injustices of the Ancien Régime. Pamphlets and sensationalized stories of escaped prisoners painted it as a Gothic house of horrors, filled with skeletons and suffering innocents. While the reality was more complex, the myth was what mattered. In the minds of the people of Paris, the Bastille was the ultimate symbol of the tyranny they sought to overthrow. On July 14, 1789, this symbolic power erupted into reality. The city of Paris was in a state of revolutionary fervor. The people, fearing an attack by royal troops, needed weapons and gunpowder to defend themselves. The massive stockpile of gunpowder stored inside the Bastille made it a primary target. A crowd of several hundred angry citizens marched on the fortress, demanding that the governor surrender the gunpowder and remove the cannons that were aimed at the city. The governor, the Marquis de Launay, refused. Negotiations broke down and fighting erupted. The revolutionary crowd, though poorly armed, was determined. They were joined by mutinous soldiers from the French Guard who brought cannons, turning the tide of the battle. After several hours of fighting, the governor surrendered. The crowd stormed the fortress, killed the governor, and triumphantly paraded his head on a pike through the streets of Paris. The French Revolution had found its first bloody victory. The storming of the Bastille was of little strategic importance. The revolutionaries found only 7 prisoners inside, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 deviant aristocrat. There were no political prisoners of note. But the symbolic victory was immense. The fall of this great royal fortress demonstrated that the king's power was not absolute, and that the people, when united, could topple the most powerful symbols of the old regime. July 14th immediately became a day of celebration, and it remains France's national day, Bastille Day, to this day. In the aftermath, the decision was quickly made to demolish the Bastille. It was to be physically erased from the landscape of Paris, just as the tyranny it represented was to be erased from the French political system. A private contractor, Pierre-François Pelloy, was hired for the job. He turned the demolition into a masterful piece of revolutionary merchandising. He sold souvenirs, stones of the Bastille, made models of the fortress from its own stones, and even had medals forged from the bolts and chains found inside. Today, almost nothing remains of the Bastille itself. Its location is now a busy traffic circle, the Place de la Bastille, dominated by a large column that commemorates not the 1789 revolution, but a later one in 1830. The outline of the fortress's original walls is marked by paving stones in the surrounding streets, a subtle reminder of the massive structure that once stood there. The Bastille is gone, but its ghost remains. It lives on as a powerful global symbol of the fight for freedom against oppression, a story of how a building can become an idea and how the fall of a single wall can signal the birth of a new world. From the heart of a revolution in Paris, let's travel back in time and across the English Channel to the shadowy world of Elizabethan England, to unravel the story of a man who was, by turns, a brilliant playwright, a tavern brawler, a spy, and a heretic. We're not talking about William Shakespeare, but about his contemporary and, for a time, his superior in fame and talent, Christopher Kit Marlowe. His life was short, violent, and shrouded in mystery, and his death in a drunken brawl at the age of 29 remains one of literature's most enduring cold cases. Christopher Marlowe was born in Canterbury in 1564, the same year as Shakespeare, to a humble shoemaker. But his prodigious intellect earned him a scholarship to Cambridge University. It was here that his life began to take a strange turn. He was frequently absent from his studies for long, unexplained periods. The university, suspecting he had secretly converted to Catholicism with the intent of becoming a priest abroad, which would have been illegal, was about to deny him his master's degree. But then, a mysterious letter arrived from Queen Elizabeth's own Privy Council, ordering the university to grant the degree, and stating that Marlowe had been engaged in, quote, matters touching the benefit of his country. This letter is the strongest piece of evidence that the brilliant young student was leading a double life. It's widely believed that Marlowe had been recruited into the Queen's Secret Service, working as a spy for Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's notoriously ruthless spy master. His job would have been to infiltrate the communities of English Catholic exiles in France, posing as a potential convert to gather intelligence on plots against the Queen. It was a dangerous game of deception and intrigue, and it seems to have instilled in Marlowe a deep cynicism about religion and power that would later appear in his plays. And the pay? It was barely a living wage to begin with, but from it, the army deducted the cost of your food, your gear, your burial fund, and any celebrations the Legion held. What you were left with was pocket change. The entire system was a state-sponsored grift designed to keep you indebted and dependent. After Cambridge, Marlowe moved to London and burst onto the city's burgeoning theater scene. His plays, like Tamburlaine the Great and Dr. Faustus, were sensational hits. They were filled with magnificent, powerful language, what became known as Marlowe's mighty line, and featured controversial, larger-than-life protagonists who challenged the limits of human ambition and morality. Tamburlaine is a shepherd who becomes a world-conquering tyrant. Dr. Faustus is a scholar who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and power. These were not the simple morality plays of the past. They were complex, dark, and thrilling. Marlowe was the rock star of the Elizabethan stage. He was far more famous than the young Shakespeare at the time. But his life off-stage was as turbulent as his plays. He was known for his sharp tongue, his atheistic pronouncements, and his quick temper. He was constantly in trouble with the law. He was arrested for his involvement in a fatal street fight, and was deported from the Netherlands for trying to counterfeit gold coins. He was a man who lived on the edge, openly questioning the religious and political orthodoxies of his time in a very dangerous era. His outspokenness eventually caught up with him. In the 1590s, the authorities, spooked by political unrest, began a crackdown on dissent. Marlowe's name came up in connection with a circle of freethinkers and atheists. An arrest warrant was issued for him after his former roommate, the playwright Thomas Kyde, was arrested and tortured. Kyde, under duress, claimed that heretical papers found in his room belonged to Marlowe. The charges were serious. Atheism was a capital offense. Marlowe was arrested on May 20th, 1593, but for some reason, he was not thrown in prison. He was released on bail, with orders to report daily to the authorities. 10 days later, on May 30th, 1593, Christopher Marlowe was dead. The official story, discovered in a coroner's report centuries later, is this. Marlowe spent the day at a boarding house in Deptford, just outside London, with 3 other men, Ingram Fraser, Nicholas Scares, and Robert Poley. All 3 men had connections to the world of espionage and shady financial dealings. According to the report, after a day of eating and drinking, Marlowe and Fraser began to argue over the reckoning, or the bill. Marlowe, lying on a bed, supposedly grabbed Fraser's dagger and attacked him from behind. Fraser, in self-defense, wrestled the dagger away and stabbed Marlowe above the right eye, killing him instantly. The coroner's jury accepted this story, and Ingram Fraser was quickly pardoned for acting in self-defense, and for centuries, that was that. Marlowe died in a squalid fight over a tavern bill, but many historians and scholars find this official account highly suspicious. The story of the fight over the bill seems too convenient, too neat. The men Marlowe was with were not just casual drinking buddies. They were shadowy figures from the world of intelligence. Robert Poley, for instance, was a trusted government courier and agent provocateur. This has led to a host of conspiracy theories. The most popular theory is that Marlowe's death was not an accident, but a political assassination. Perhaps he knew too much from his time as a spy. Perhaps his powerful patrons like Sir Walter Raleigh feared he would implicate them in his heresy trial and had him silenced. The fight over the bill in this reading was a cover story, concocted by professional agents to eliminate a man who had become a liability. The quick pardon for the killer only adds to the suspicion. Another, more elaborate theory, though one with little evidence, is that Marlowe's death was faked. In this version, his powerful friends staged his death to help him escape the country and avoid being tried and executed for atheism. Proponents of this theory are often the same people who believe that Marlowe went on to write the plays we now attribute to William Shakespeare. The Marlovian theory of Shakespearean authorship rests on the idea that only a university-educated genius like Marlowe could have written those works, not a grammar school-educated man from Stratford-upon-Avon. Whatever the truth of his death, Christopher Marlowe's influence is undeniable. He revolutionized English drama, paving the way for Shakespeare with his powerful verse, complex characters, and tragic themes. He was a brilliant, reckless, and boundary-pushing artist who lived and died in a world of spies, secrets, and violence. His story is a tantalizing glimpse into the dangerous underworld of Elizabethan England, where the line between poet and spy was perilously thin. He remains a figure of intense fascination, a literary giant whose final act is a mystery we will likely never solve. From the violent end of a playwright's life, let's now turn to the birth of an idea that has shaped the modern world in countless ways: the concept of insurance. It's a system so embedded in our daily lives, from our cars to our homes to our health, that we rarely stop to think about its origins. But the idea of paying a small, regular amount to protect against a large, uncertain loss is not a modern invention. It's an ancient concept, born from the collaboration of merchants and mathematicians, and refined in the smoky coffee houses of 17th century London. The basic principle of insurance, pooling resources to share risk, is as old as civilization itself. As early as the 3rd millennium BCE, Chinese and Babylonian merchants practiced a form of it. A merchant sending a boatload of goods down a treacherous river would have his cargo's value divided among several other merchants. If the boat was lost, the loss was shared by all, not borne by one individual. Similarly, Greek and Roman burial societies were a form of life insurance. Members paid monthly dues into a common fund, which would then be used to ensure a proper funeral and support the surviving family of any member who died. Most of your 25-year service won't be spent in glorious battle. It will be spent in crushing boredom. You'll be standing guard duty on a rainy wall in Germania, building a road in the middle of nowhere, or gambling away your meager pay with dice. It's a life of endless waiting, punctuated by misery. However, the true birthplace of modern insurance as a formal business was in the bustling maritime trade of medieval and Renaissance Italy. Cities like Genoa and Venice were the epicenters of global commerce, sending valuable cargoes of spices, silks, and other goods across the unpredictable Mediterranean Sea. The risk of losing a ship to pirates or storms was immense. To manage this risk, merchants developed the, quote, marine insurance policy. A merchant would pay a premium, a percentage of the cargo's value, to an underwriter, who, in exchange, would promise to cover the cost of the cargo if the ship failed to arrive. This is where the term underwriter comes from. In the 14th century, a broker would circulate a document detailing a ship, its captain, its route, and its cargo. Wealthy individuals who were willing to take on a portion of the risk would literally write their names under the description of the risk, indicating the percentage they were willing to cover in exchange for a portion of the premium. This was insurance in its most basic form, a bet on the safe return of a ship, backed by the personal wealth of a group of investors. The practice of marine insurance spread from Italy to the other great trading nations of Europe, but the industry found its true home in London in the late 17th century. Specifically in a small coffee house on Tower Street run by a man named Edward Lloyd. Lloyd's Coffee House became the go-to meeting place for sailors, ship captains, merchants, and the wealthy individuals who insured their voyages. It wasn't an insurance company itself, but a hub of information. Lloyd provided his patrons with reliable shipping news, auctioning off ships and cargoes, and creating a centralized marketplace for marine insurance. The underwriters at Lloyd's began to form associations, creating a more organized and reliable market. They developed standardized policy forms and a reputation for integrity. If you had a policy underwritten at Lloyd's, you could be confident that your claim would be paid. This institution evolved over time into the world-famous insurance market, Lloyd's of London, which still exists today. It's a fascinating example of how a major global industry grew out of the informal conversations and business deals conducted in a single smoke-filled room. While marine insurance protected goods, other forms of insurance were developing to protect against different kinds of risks. The Great Fire of London in 1666, which destroyed over 13,000 houses, was a major catalyst for the invention of fire insurance. In the aftermath of the disaster, a maverick economist and builder named Nicholas Barbon opened the insurance office for houses. For a small premium, he would insure a building against fire. His fire brigades, identified by a metal fire mark plaque on the insured building, would rush to put out fires, but only on the properties he insured. The development of life insurance required a more scientific approach. Early life insurance was essentially a gamble on someone's life with no real statistical basis. But in the late 17th century, the fields of mathematics and statistics began to advance. Thinkers like Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat developed probability theory, and an English haberdasher named John Grant conducted the first systematic analysis of mortality rates in London. He created life tables showing the probability of a person of a certain age dying in a given year. This was a revolutionary breakthrough. For the first time, the risk of death could be mathematically calculated. This allowed for the creation of the first truly scientific life insurance companies. In 1762, the Society for Equitable Assurances on Lives and Survivorship was founded in London. It was the first mutual insurer, using actuarial tables to set premiums based on the age of the insured. This put life insurance on a sound financial footing and transformed it from a form of gambling into a respectable financial tool for providing for one's family. From these origins in protecting ships, houses, and lives, the concept of insurance has expanded to cover nearly every conceivable risk. Today, you can get insurance for your health, your car, your crops, your business, and even for a concert being canceled due to rain. There's even insurance for insurers, known as reinsurance. The fundamental principle, however, remains the same as it was for those ancient Babylonian merchants. The many pay a little to protect the few from a catastrophic loss. The history of insurance is, in many ways, the history of our attempts to control the uncontrollable. It's a story of how we have learned to quantify misfortune, to put a price on risk, and to create a safety net against the inherent uncertainties of life. It's a quiet, often overlooked, but profoundly important human innovation that allows us to build, to travel, and to invest with a greater sense of security. It's the business of selling peace of mind, one policy at a time. Let us now pivot from the calculated world of risk management to a story of pure, unadulterated spectacle, a tale of architectural folly and imperial ego on a colossal scale. We are going to explore the bizarre and fascinating history of the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This gigantic bronze statue, which stood for less than a century, was not just a work of art. It was a powerful statement of victory, a monument to defiance, and a testament to the incredible ambition of a small island state that had dared to stand up to a king. If you do see battle, it's not the clean, heroic affair from the propaganda sculptures. It is a terrifying, visceral meat grinder. It's the sound of screaming, the smell of blood and filth, and the sight of your friends, men you've lived with for years, being cut down beside you. Your job is to simply hold the line and keep stabbing. The story of the Colossus begins with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. His vast empire was thrown into chaos as his generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors, immediately began fighting each other for control. The small but wealthy island of Rhodes, a major trading hub in the Aegean Sea, tried to remain neutral in these wars, wanting only to protect its lucrative trade networks. However, their neutrality was not to be respected. One of the most powerful of the successors, Antigonus I Monophthalmus, the One-Eyed, demanded that Rhodes join him in his war against another general, Ptolemy, who ruled Egypt. The Rhodians, who had strong commercial ties to Egypt, refused. Enraged by this defiance, Antigonus sent his son Demetrius to conquer the island in 305 BCE. Demetrius was a master of siege warfare, earning him the nickname Poliorketes, or the Besieger. He arrived at Rhodes with a massive army and a fleet of ships, confident of a swift victory. What followed was one of the most epic sieges of the ancient world. For an entire year, Demetrius threw everything he had at the city of Rhodes. He built enormous siege towers, including his infamous Helepolis, or Taker of Cities, a 9-story iron-plated tower on wheels, armed with catapults and battering rams. But the Rhodians, with their formidable city walls and determined resistance, fought him off at every turn. They flooded the ground in front of the walls to bog down the siege engines and launched daring counterattacks. Finally, with help from his rival Ptolemy, the Rhodians forced Demetrius to give up and sail away, leaving his expensive siege equipment behind. The Rhodians had done the impossible. They had defied one of the most powerful military forces in the world and won. To commemorate this great victory, and to thank their patron god, Helios, the god of the sun, they decided to build a monument on an unprecedented scale. And they would fund it by selling the vast quantities of bronze and iron equipment that Demetrius had abandoned in his retreat. They would build their monument to freedom using the very weapons of their would-be conqueror. The commission for the statue was given to a local sculptor named Chares of Lindos, who had been a student of the great Lysippos, Alexander the Great's personal sculptor. The statue was to be a colossal bronze figure of the sun god Helios. It took 12 years to build, from 292 to 280 BCE. The construction was an incredible feat of ancient engineering. First, a massive stone pedestal was built. Then, an iron framework was erected, to which the bronze plates that formed the skin of the statue were attached. As the statue grew in height, it was filled with stones to provide stability. The Colossus stood an astonishing 33 meters, or about 108 feet high, roughly the height of the Statue of Liberty from her feet to her torch. It was one of the tallest man-made structures of its time. For centuries, popular imagination, fueled by medieval drawings and a sonnet by Shakespeare, has pictured the Colossus straddling the entrance to the harbor of Rhodes, with ships sailing between its legs. This image is almost certainly a romantic fantasy. From an engineering standpoint, it would have been impossible to construct, and it would have blocked the harbor for years. A more plausible reconstruction, based on archaeological evidence and ancient accounts, places the statue on a pedestal either at the harbor entrance or slightly further inland, overlooking the port. It likely depicted a nude Helios with a crown of sun rays on his head, perhaps shielding his eyes with one hand as he gazed out to sea, or holding a torch aloft, much like the Statue of Liberty. Whatever its exact pose, it must have been an awe-inspiring sight. A gleaming bronze giant welcoming ships to the prosperous and defiant island. The Colossus of Rhodes did not stand for long. In 226 BCE, just 54 years after its completion, the island of Rhodes was struck by a powerful earthquake. The mighty statue buckled at the knees and came crashing down. The Rhodian king, Ptolemy III of Egypt, offered to pay for its reconstruction, but the Rhodians, after consulting the Oracle of Delphi, refused. The Oracle had warned them not to rebuild it, suggesting that they had somehow offended Helios with their hubris. And so, for the next 800 years, the magnificent ruins of the Colossus lay on the ground where they had fallen. Even in their broken state, they remained a major tourist attraction. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who saw the ruins, wrote that few men can clasp the thumb in their arms, and its fingers were larger than most statues. The sheer scale of the broken giant continued to astound visitors for centuries. The final ignominious end of the Colossus came in 653 CE. An Arab force under Muawiyah I captured Rhodes. According to the chronicler Theophanes, they sold the fallen bronze pieces as scrap metal to a Jewish merchant from Edessa. The story claims that it took 900 camels to carry all the bronze away. And with that, the last physical remnants of this wonder of the ancient world vanished from history, melted down to be reused for coins, tools, or weapons. If you are wounded, the Roman medical corps is surprisingly sophisticated. They have surgical tools and dedicated doctors. But there's no anesthetic beyond a swig of cheap wine, and no understanding of germ theory. Infection is as likely to kill you as the initial wound. Surviving surgery was often just the beginning of the ordeal. The Colossus of Rhodes, despite its brief existence, has had a colossal legacy. It has become a metaphor for anything of immense size and power. Its story is a classic tale of hubris and fate, a monument built to celebrate a victory over man, only to be toppled by the power of nature. It lives on in our imagination as a symbol of immense ambition and the fleeting nature of even the most monumental achievements. It was a wonder of the world, not just for its size, but for the defiant spirit it represented. Let's now delve into the history of a document, a piece of parchment signed under duress in a meadow by the River Thames, that has become a cornerstone of modern democracy and a global symbol of liberty. We're going to explore the story of Magna Carta. While it was initially a failed peace treaty between a despised king and a group of rebellious barons, its core principles, that no one, not even the king, is above the law, have echoed down the centuries, influencing constitutions and freedom movements all over the world. The story begins with one of England's most disastrous kings, King John. Ascending to the throne in 1199, John was a deeply unpopular ruler. He was paranoid, cruel, and militarily incompetent. He lost vast territories in France that had been held by his family, earning him the nickname John Softsword. To fund his failed wars, he imposed exorbitant and arbitrary taxes on his barons, seized their lands, and sold off justice to the highest bidder. He ruled not by law but by his own whim, treating England as his personal piggy bank. By 1215, the barons of England had had enough. A powerful group of them renounced their oaths of fealty to the king and rose in open rebellion, capturing the city of London. King John, facing a full-blown civil war and with his back against the wall, was forced to negotiate. On June 15, 1215, he met the rebellious barons at a field called Runnymede. There, he reluctantly agreed to their demands and affixed his royal seal to a document they had prepared, the, quote, Articles of the Barons, which would soon be formalized as Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. Magna Carta was not, at its heart, a lofty declaration of universal human rights. It was a practical document, a list of 63 grievances and demands from a group of wealthy, powerful men looking to protect their own privileges and property from a tyrannical king. Many of its clauses deal with specific feudal rights and customs, like the regulation of inheritance fees, the rights of widows, and the proper use of fish weirs in the Thames. It was a peace treaty designed to solve a specific political crisis. However, buried within this list of baronial demands were a few clauses that contained the seeds of a revolutionary idea. The most famous of these are clauses 39 and 40. Clause 39 states, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." Clause 40 adds, "To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice." For the first time, a ruling monarch had formally accepted that his power was limited by the law. These clauses established the principles of due process and trial by jury, and they asserted that there was a law of the land that even the king was bound to obey. The charter also created a council of 25 barons who were empowered to distress and distrain the king. In other words, to seize his castles and lands if he failed to uphold the agreement. This was a radical check on royal power, an early form of constitutional oversight. In the short term, Magna Carta was a spectacular failure. Neither side was negotiating in good faith. The barons didn't trust John, and John had no intention of honoring the charter. As soon as the barons left Runnymede, he appealed to the Pope Innocent III, who promptly declared Magna Carta null and void, calling it shameful and demeaning. This plunged England back into civil war. The charter seemed dead on arrival, a failed document from a forgotten rebellion. But then, King John conveniently died of dysentery the following year in 1216. His son, the 9-year-old Henry III, inherited the throne. The moderate barons, seeking to unite the country behind the young king, saw an opportunity. They reissued Magna Carta, this time with some of the more radical clauses removed, as a way to win back the support of the rebels. The charter was reissued again in 1217, and then in a final, definitive version in 1225. It was this 1225 version that was entered into the official statute roll of England. Over the following centuries, Magna Carta was reconfirmed by successive kings and became a powerful symbol for those challenging royal authority. It was invoked by Parliament in its struggles with the Stuart kings in the 17th century. The great jurist Sir Edward Coke reinterpreted Magna Carta not just as a protector of the rights of barons, but as a guarantee of the individual liberties of all English subjects. This reinterpretation was hugely influential. Your reward for surviving 25 years of this is the honesta missio, or honorable discharge. You're promised a plot of land to farm, and if you weren't one already, Roman citizenship. But often, the land was of poor quality in a remote, hostile province. A final, cynical thank you from the empire you gave your life to. When English colonists traveled to the New World, they brought the principles of Magna Carta with them. It became a foundational text for the American Revolution. The American colonists argued that the British government, by imposing taxes without their consent, was violating their ancient rights as Englishmen, rights that were enshrined in Magna Carta. Its influence is clearly visible in the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights, particularly in the guarantees of due process and the right to a jury trial. From there, the influence of Magna Carta spread around the globe. It has been cited as an inspiration for countless movements for liberty and constitutional government, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Nelson Mandela himself referred to Magna Carta in his famous speech from the dock in 1964, citing it as one of the foundations of the democratic ideals he was fighting for. The story of Magna Carta is a remarkable example of how a document's meaning can evolve and grow far beyond its original intent. It began as a self-serving deal between a bad king and a group of powerful nobles, a document concerned with feudal privileges. But its core idea, the rule of law, was so powerful that it was seized upon by later generations and transformed into a universal symbol of freedom, justice, and the principle that government must be accountable to the people it governs. It is, as the saying goes, the foundation of liberty. Let's now turn our gaze upward, from the laws of man to the laws of the cosmos, and explore the story of a scientific revolution that fundamentally changed humanity's place in the universe. We're going to examine the life and work of Nicolaus Copernicus, the quiet, unassuming Polish canon who dared to suggest that the Earth was not the center of everything, and in doing so, knocked humanity off its celestial pedestal and set in motion the birth of modern astronomy. For over 400 years, the Western world's understanding of the cosmos was dominated by one man, Claudius Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic system, developed in the 2nd century CE, was a masterpiece of geocentric cosmology. It placed a stationary Earth at the center of the universe, with the moon, sun, planets, and stars all revolving around it in a complex system of perfect circles and epicycles, circles upon circles. This model was not only mathematically elegant for its time, but it also aligned perfectly with Christian theology, which placed humanity at the center of God's creation. It was the undisputed, church-sanctioned truth. Nicolaus Copernicus was born in 1473 in Thorn, modern-day Turin, Poland. He was a true Renaissance man, studying law, medicine, and mathematics at universities in Italy. He was not a professional astronomer, but a canon in the Cathedral of Frombork, a church administrator. His astronomical work was a lifelong passion project, conducted in his spare time in a tower overlooking the Baltic coast. He was a quiet, cautious, and deeply religious man, not a natural revolutionary. Copernicus became increasingly dissatisfied with the Ptolemaic system. To account for the observed motions of the planets, particularly their strange retrograde or backward motion, Ptolemy's model had become incredibly complicated and clunky. It required dozens of epicycles and other mathematical contrivances that Copernicus found to be neither sufficiently absolute nor sufficiently pleasing to the mind. He believed that the Creator would not have designed such a messy and inelegant universe. He began to search for a simpler, more harmonious explanation. He found his inspiration in the writings of ancient Greek philosophers, some of whom had proposed that the Earth might move. This gave him the intellectual courage to explore a radical new idea. What if the Sun, not the Earth, was the center of the universe? What if the Earth was just another planet, orbiting the Sun annually while also spinning on its own axis daily? He began to work out the mathematics of this heliocentric system. What he discovered was stunning. By placing the Sun at the center, the entire cosmic dance became far simpler and more elegant. The confusing retrograde motion of the planets was no longer a real movement, but an illusion, an effect caused by the Earth itself moving, overtaking the outer planets in its own orbit. The model naturally explained the order of the planets and the varying brightness of Venus and Mercury. It was a system of beautiful mathematical harmony that appealed deeply to Copernicus's Neoplatonic sensibilities. Despite the elegance of his theory, Copernicus was terrified to publish it. He knew his ideas were heretical. They directly contradicted not only 400 years of scientific consensus, but also several passages of scripture that seemed to describe a stationary Earth. He feared the ridicule of his fellow scholars and the wrath of the church. For decades, he kept his work to himself, circulating only a short, handwritten summary among a few trusted friends. And as always, I love seeing how far these stories travel, so please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. It's a small thing, but it really does make this feel like a shared experience. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So to be a legionary was to be a cog in the most effective and ruthless military machine of the ancient world. It was a life of drudgery, pain, and fear, traded for the slimmest chance of a better life at the very end. It wasn't glorious, it was a job, and it really sucked. It was only at the end of his life, urged on by a young German mathematician named Georg Joachim Rheticus, who had traveled to Poland to study with him, that Copernicus finally agreed to publish his life's work. The book De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, was printed in 1543. The story goes that Copernicus, who had suffered a stroke and was on his deathbed, was handed the first printed copy of his book, just hours before he died. He had launched his revolution, but he would not be around to witness its consequences. To soften the blow of its radical content, the book's publisher, a Lutheran theologian named Andreas Osiander, added an anonymous, unauthorized preface. This preface stated that the heliocentric model was not being presented as a physical reality, but merely as a useful mathematical hypothesis for calculating the positions of the planets. This helped to shield the book from immediate condemnation, allowing it to circulate among mathematicians and astronomers who could appreciate its technical brilliance. For the first few decades, the Copernican model was not widely accepted. It had its own problems, because Copernicus, like Ptolemy, still clung to the ancient Greek belief that all celestial motion must be in perfect circles. His model didn't actually predict the positions of the planets any better than the old system. It would take the work of later astronomers, like Johannes Kepler, who discovered that planets move in ellipses, not circles, and Galileo Galilei, whose telescopic observations provided the first direct physical evidence for a sun-centered system, to truly vindicate Copernicus. The Catholic Church, initially quiet on the matter, eventually reacted forcefully. In 1616, as Galileo's defense of Copernicus grew more vocal, the Church officially condemned the heliocentric theory as, quote, foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical. Copernicus's book was placed on the Index of Forbidden Books, where it remained for nearly 200 years. The battle between the new science and the old religious authority had begun in earnest. The Copernican revolution was more than just a change in astronomical models. It was a profound shift in human consciousness. By removing Earth from the center of the universe, Copernicus inadvertently demoted humanity from its privileged position in the cosmos. We were no longer the stationary observers at the heart of creation, but inhabitants of a small planet adrift in a vast, seemingly infinite universe. This was a deeply unsettling, but ultimately liberating realization that paved the way for the scientific enlightenment and the modern world. From the cosmic shift of the Copernican revolution, let us descend into the subterranean world beneath a modern metropolis, to uncover the story of a project born of Victorian ambition, ingenuity, and a desperate need to solve an urban crisis. We're going to explore the creation of the London Underground, the world's first subterranean railway. It's a story of technological triumph over immense challenges, a tale of how the tube transformed London and became a beloved, if sometimes frustrating, icon of the city. By the mid-19th century, London was the largest and most congested city in the world. Its population had exploded, and its narrow, medieval street plan was completely overwhelmed. The streets were choked with a chaotic, gridlocked mess of horse-drawn omnibuses, carriages, carts, and pedestrians. A journey across the city that should have taken minutes could take hours. The city was, quite literally, grinding to a halt. A radical new solution was needed. The idea of an underground railway had been proposed as early as the 1830s, but it was widely ridiculed. The press mocked the idea of traveling in dark, smoky tunnels, and many people feared the tunnels would collapse, or that passengers would be asphyxiated by the fumes. But one man, a visionary solicitor named Charles Pearson, championed the idea relentlessly for years. He saw an underground railway not just as a solution to traffic, but as a social project, a way for workers to live in healthier suburbs and commute easily into the city. After years of lobbying and fundraising, Pearson's vision finally gained traction. In 1860, construction began on the first line, the Metropolitan Railway. The engineering challenge was immense. The method they used was called cut and cover. A massive trench, sometimes as deep as 10 meters, was dug along the route of a major road. Brick walls were built inside the trench, a vaulted brick roof was added, and then the entire thing was buried, and the road was rebuilt on top. It was incredibly disruptive, turning major London thoroughfares into massive open construction sites for months on end. The construction was a chaotic and dangerous process. Workers had to navigate a hidden underground maze of sewers, water mains, and gas pipes. There were frequent tunnel collapses and floods. One of the most serious incidents occurred when the Fleet Ditch, one of London's ancient, buried rivers and essentially an open sewer, burst its banks and flooded a section of the tunnel, delaying construction for months. They were not just digging a railway. They were performing major surgery on the city's hidden infrastructure. Now, let's drift from the gritty reality of a soldier's life to a place built on an idea, a dream of collecting all the world's knowledge under one roof. Let's talk about the Great Library of Alexandria. It wasn't just a building with a lot of scrolls. It was an institution, a grand project of the human intellect born from the ambition of kings. After Alexander the Great's death, his empire was carved up by his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy Soter, a clever and cultured man who wanted his new capital, Alexandria, to be more than just a center of trade. He wanted it to be the undisputed center of thought for the entire Hellenistic world. The library was the tool to make that happen, an intellectual lighthouse meant to draw in the greatest minds like moths to a flame. On January 10, 1863, the Metropolitan Railway opened to the public. It ran for just under 4 miles, connecting the mainline railway stations at Paddington, Euston, and King's Cross with the city's financial district. Despite the public's initial fears, it was an immediate and overwhelming success. On its first day, 38,000 people queued up to take a ride. They were amazed by the novelty of traveling beneath the city streets in gas-lit wooden carriages, pulled by specially designed steam locomotives that were fitted with condensers to reduce the amount of smoke they released into the tunnels. The success of the first line sparked a wave of tube mania. Rival companies sprang up, and a network of cut-and-cover lines began to spread across London. However, these lines were limited to following the paths of existing wide roads. To go deeper and create a more extensive network, a new technology was needed. This came in the form of the Great Head Shield, a circular, iron tunneling shield that allowed workers to bore deep, tube-like tunnels through the stable London clay, far beneath the buildings and existing infrastructure. The advent of deep-level tube tunneling, combined with the development of safe electric traction to replace the smoky steam engines, led to the next great expansion of the network in the 1890s and early 1900s. Lines like the City and South London Railway, the first deep-level electric railway in the world, began to crisscross the city. These new tube lines, with their distinctive red-tiled stations designed by the architect Leslie Green, formed the core of the network we know today. The Underground's identity was further solidified in the early 20th century, under the leadership of a brilliant American transport magnate, Albert Stanley, and a visionary publicity manager, Frank Pick. They unified the various competing lines into a single, coherent system. They commissioned the famous Roundel logo and the iconic Johnston typeface, creating a powerful and instantly recognizable brand identity. And most importantly, they commissioned the first schematic map of the network, designed by Harry Beck in 1931. Beck's map, which abandoned geographical accuracy in favor of diagrammatic clarity, was a work of genius that became the standard for transit maps all over the world. The London Underground played a crucial role in the city's history, most notably during the Second World War. During the Blitz, the deep-level tube stations were transformed into massive public air raid shelters. Hundreds of thousands of Londoners would descend into the tunnels each night to sleep on the platforms, seeking refuge from the German bombing raids above. The Underground became a symbol of the city's resilience, a place of community and safety in a time of great fear. Today, the London Underground is a sprawling network that carries over 1 billion passengers a year. It is a vital artery of the city, an essential part of the daily lives of millions. It is a system that is both historic and constantly evolving, with its Victorian brickwork tunnels sitting alongside modern, air-conditioned trains. Its story is a testament to the power of bold ideas and incredible engineering to solve the problems of urban life, a reminder that sometimes the best way forward is to go down. For our final story tonight, let's turn to an object of quiet contemplation, a game of strategy and intellect that has been called the royal game. We're going to trace the long and fascinating history of chess. More than just a board game, chess is a mirror of human history, its evolution reflecting the cultures, conflicts, and intellectual currents of the civilizations that embraced it. Its journey from an ancient Indian war game to a global obsession is a story of migration, adaptation, and the enduring appeal of a battle of pure wits. The earliest ancestor of chess is believed to be a game called Chaturanga, which emerged in the Gupta Empire of India around the 6th century CE. Chaturanga, which means 4 divisions in Sanskrit, was a simulation of the Indian army of the time. The pieces represented the 4 divisions of the military: infantry, cavalry, elephants, and chariots, along with a king, Raja, and his advisor, Mantri. The game was played on an 8x8 board, and the goal, much like in modern chess, was to checkmate the opposing king. From India, the game spread eastward to China, where it evolved into Xiangqi, Chinese chess, and westward into Persia. In the Sasanian Empire of Persia, the game was embraced by the nobility and became known as chatrang. The Persians made several key modifications. They introduced the phrase Shah Mat, meaning the king is ambushed, or the king is helpless, which is the direct origin of our word checkmate. They also started the tradition of shouting Shah, king, when the king was under attack, the ancestor of check. After the Arab conquest of Persia in the 7th century, the game was adopted by the Muslim world. It became known as shatranj, and it flourished throughout the Islamic Golden Age. Arab players were passionate about the game, writing the first books on chess theory, analyzing openings, and studying endgame problems. The pieces' names were adapted into Arabic, and the game spread with the expansion of Islam across North Africa and into Europe through the Moorish invasion of Spain. The mission statement of the library was both breathtakingly simple and impossibly ambitious: to obtain a copy of every single book in the known world. This wasn't a passive collection. The Ptolemaic kings were aggressive curators. Any ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor was searched. If a book was found, it was seized, taken to the library, and copied by scribes. The original was kept for the library's collection, and the fresh copy was politely returned to its owner. It was, in essence, state-sanctioned intellectual piracy on a massive scale. They also sent agents across the Mediterranean and into Asia, armed with vast sums of money to buy up entire collections, creating the first real international book market and, in the process, making knowledge a geopolitical commodity. When chess arrived in medieval Europe around the 10th century, it underwent its most significant transformation. The game was adapted to reflect the structure of European feudal society. The Persian pieces were given new identities. The Shah remained the king. The Furzan, advisor, became the queen, initially a much weaker piece. The elephant, a war animal unfamiliar to most Europeans, became the bishop. The horse remained the knight, and the chariot became the rook, or castle. The infantry pawn stayed largely the same. For centuries, medieval chess was a much slower and more ponderous game than the one we play today. The queen could only move 1 square diagonally, and the bishop was limited to jumping 2 squares diagonally. The game could take a very long time to finish. The major change came in the late 15th century, during the Renaissance. Around 1475, in either Spain, Portugal, or Italy, a new, more powerful set of rules emerged. This new version was called Mad Queen's Chess. The queen was transformed from the weakest piece into the most powerful piece on the board, able to move any number of squares in any direction. The bishop was also given its modern, sweeping diagonal move. These changes dramatically sped up the game, made it more dynamic, and placed a new emphasis on a quick, decisive attack. This is essentially the version of chess we still play today. Some historians have linked the rise of the powerful chess queen to the rise of powerful female monarchs in Europe at the time, like Isabella I of Castile. From the Renaissance onward, chess became a popular pastime for the European aristocracy and the rising intellectual class. It was seen as a training ground for the mind, a way to cultivate strategic thinking and discipline. The first modern chess tournaments began to be held in the 19th century, and the first official world chess champion, Wilhelm Steinitz, was crowned in 1886. The game had evolved from a pastime into a serious international sport. The 20th century saw chess become a tool of Cold War political rivalry. The Soviet Union heavily promoted chess, seeing it as a symbol of socialist intellectual superiority. The state-sponsored Soviet chess machine produced a long line of world champions who dominated the game for decades. This dominance was famously challenged in the 1972 match of the century, when the eccentric American prodigy Bobby Fischer defeated Boris Spassky in a dramatic showdown in Reykjavik, Iceland, that captured the world's attention. In the late 20th century, chess faced its next great challenger, the computer. In 1997, the IBM supercomputer Deep Blue defeated the reigning world champion, Garry Kasparov, in a landmark match. This event marked a turning point, demonstrating that a machine could surpass the greatest human mind in a game once thought to be the ultimate expression of human intellect. Today, chess is more popular than ever, played by millions online, with human players learning from and collaborating with powerful computer engines. The journey of this ancient game continues, a timeless battle of 64 squares, forever reinventing itself, a quiet testament to our enduring fascination with the art of strategy. The library itself was part of a larger research institution called the Museum, or Shrine of the Muses. This wasn't a museum in our modern sense, but a prototype for the modern university. Scholars who were invited to work there were given generous salaries, tax exemptions, and free room and board. Their only job was to think, to study, to debate, and to write. They were, in effect, the first professional academics, paid by the state, not for a specific product, but for the act of intellectual pursuit itself. This environment, free from the daily struggle for survival, allowed for an explosion of scientific, mathematical, and philosophical breakthroughs that would shape the course of Western civilization for centuries to come. It was here, within the halls of the museum, that humanity first took the true measure of its world. Eratosthenes, a librarian and geographer, calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy, using nothing more than sticks, shadows, and some brilliant geometry. It was here that Euclid wrote his Elements, the foundational textbook for geometry that would remain in use for over 2 millennia. It was here that Hero of Alexandria designed the first steam engine, the Aeolipile, a whimsical toy at the time, but a device that held the seed of the Industrial Revolution. The library wasn't just storing knowledge, it was actively creating it. Imagine walking through its colonnaded halls. The air is thick with the dry, papery scent of thousands upon thousands of scrolls. They are organized meticulously on wooden shelves, each with a small clay tag identifying its contents. A system developed by the poet Callimachus called the Pinakes, the world's first library catalog. You would hear the quiet scratching of reed pens on papyrus, the low murmur of scholars from Greece, Persia, and Judea debating fine points of philosophy or astronomy in hushed Greek. It was a sanctuary of thought, a quiet island of reason in a turbulent world, a place where the collective memory of humanity was gathered and codified. The sheer scale of the collection is difficult to comprehend. At its peak, estimates suggest the library held anywhere from 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls. Each scroll wasn't necessarily a full book, as we'd think of it. A single work like Homer's Iliad would have taken up dozens of scrolls. But the sheer volume of text was unprecedented. It contained the plays of Sophocles and Euripides, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, historical accounts from across the ancient world, medical treatises, mathematical proofs, and countless works of poetry and literature that are now lost to us forever. It was a fragile, papyrus-based backup of the entire ancient mind. So what happened to it? The story of the library's destruction is not one single fiery event as is often portrayed. It's a sad, slow, and much more complicated tale of decline, budget cuts, and a series of unfortunate events. The first major blow came in 48 BCE during Julius Caesar's civil war. While fighting in Alexandria, he set fire to ships in the harbor. The fire spread and, according to some accounts, burned a warehouse containing scrolls destined for the library, or possibly a portion of the library itself. It was a significant loss, but it wasn't the end. The library and the scholarly community around it endured. The real rot set in from within. Later Ptolemaic rulers were less enlightened than the dynasty's founder. They were more concerned with political intrigue and decadence than with funding scholarly pursuits. Budgets were slashed. In 145 BCE, Ptolemy VIII, a particularly nasty ruler, expelled all foreign scholars from Alexandria in a fit of paranoia, gutting the intellectual heart of the museum. The institution became increasingly provincial and less of a global magnet for talent. The focus shifted away from new research and more towards preservation and commentary on the old masters. The vibrant, living center of thought began to ossify into a simple archive. Then came the rise of militant religious zealotry. By the 4th century CE, Alexandria was a hotbed of tension between pagans, Jews, and the increasingly powerful Christians. The library, with its vast collection of pagan knowledge and philosophy, became a symbol of the old world that some hardliners wanted to erase. In 391 CE, the Christian patriarch of Alexandria, a man named Theophilus, incited a mob to destroy the Serapeum, a temple that housed a significant daughter collection of the main library. While it's debated if the Great Library itself was still fully operational, this act was a fatal blow to the city's intellectual heritage, a clear statement that faith, not reason, was now the supreme authority. To understand why it wasn't exactly a dream job, we first have to ask why you, a young man in the Roman world, would even sign up. It wasn't for glory. It was because you were poor. You were a farmer whose land failed, or a city dweller with no prospects. The army was a ticket out of poverty, or so they told you. The final quiet end likely came with the Muslim conquest of Egypt in 642 CE. A popular but likely apocryphal story tells of the conquering general asking the caliph what to do with the books. The caliph supposedly replied, "If these books agree with the Quran, they are redundant. If they disagree, they are heretical. Destroy them." The story claims the scrolls were then used as fuel to heat Alexandria's bathhouses for 6 months. While historians largely discredit this tale as later propaganda, it speaks to the ultimate fate of the library. It wasn't destroyed in one great cataclysm, but slowly faded away through neglect, political strife, and the changing tides of ideology, until there was simply nothing left to save. The loss of the Library of Alexandria represents one of the greatest intellectual tragedies in human history. We can only speculate on what was lost. We know of plays by Aeschylus and Sophocles of which we only have the titles. We know of historical accounts that would have shed light on entire civilizations. We know of scientific and medical texts that might have contained knowledge that had to be rediscovered, painfully, centuries later. It's a haunting reminder that knowledge is fragile, that progress is not inevitable, and that a society can, through apathy and intolerance, choose to forget its own wisdom. The library is a ghost, a dream of a world more enlightened than the one that followed. Now, leaving the quiet, dusty halls of Alexandria, let's set sail on a much more turbulent sea, into a world of violence, strategy, and astonishing power. We're heading to the South China Sea in the early 19th century, a place teeming with pirates. But we're not focusing on just any pirate. We're going to tell the story of the single most successful pirate in all of human history, a person who commanded a fleet larger than many national navies and brought the Chinese Empire to its knees. Her name was Zhang Yisao, though she began her life with a much more common name, Shi Yang. Born in 1775 in the coastal province of Guangdong, Shi Yang's early life was one of poverty and anonymity. Like many young women with few options, she found herself working as a prostitute on one of the the floating brothels that catered to sailors and merchants in the port city of Canton. It was here, in this seemingly powerless position, that she learned her first lessons in navigating the world of men, power, and money. She was known for her intelligence and shrewdness, and it was these qualities that caught the eye of a notorious pirate commander named Zhang Yi, who led a powerful coalition of Cantonese pirate fleets. In 1801, Zhang Yi either abducted or proposed to her. The legends vary, but what is clear is that Shi Yang did not enter the arrangement as a passive captive. She negotiated. She demanded a share of the power and an equal stake in the leadership of his pirate confederation. Zhang Yi, recognizing her sharp mind and ambition, agreed. She became his wife and, more importantly, his partner. She was no longer Shi Yang, the prostitute. She was now Zheng Yi Sao, wife of Zheng Yi, and she immediately began to prove her worth, not just as a consort, but as a brilliant strategist and administrator. For 6 years, the couple worked together to consolidate their power. They organized their sprawling pirate coalition, known as the Red Flag Fleet, into a highly disciplined and organized fighting force. They established rules, territories, and a system for distributing plunder that was fair enough to maintain loyalty among the notoriously fractious pirate captains. Zheng Yi Sao was instrumental in this, her skills in management and diplomacy complementing her husband's martial prowess. They were building not just a pirate gang, but a veritable maritime state with its own government, laws, and economy, operating just beyond the reach of the Qing dynasty. Then, in 1807, disaster struck. Yang Yi was killed, either in a typhoon or in battle. The records are unclear. In the patriarchal world of 19th century China, this should have been the end of Zheng Yi Sao's influence. She was a widow, and power was expected to pass to another male leader. But Zheng Yi Sao had no intention of fading into the background. She had spent 6 years learning the intricacies of the pirate world, and she knew she was more capable of leading the Red Flag Fleet than any of the ambitious captains vying for control. She moved quickly and decisively to secure her position. Her first move was to cultivate a crucial alliance with her late husband's adopted son and second-in-command, a formidable younger captain named Chung Po Tsai. He was a respected warrior and commanded great loyalty among the men. By forming a strategic partnership, and later a romantic one, with him, she legitimized her authority. She retained command of the overall strategy and administration, while he became the public face of the fleet's military operations. It was a masterstroke of political maneuvering that outflanked all her rivals and solidified her control over the entire confederation. With her power secure, Zheng Yi Sao's reign truly began. And her first order of business was to implement a strict, non-negotiable code of laws that governed every aspect of pirate life. This code was brutally effective. Any pirate who gave orders on his own or disobeyed a superior was immediately beheaded. Stealing from the common plunder fund or from villagers who supplied the pirates was a capital offense, and her rules regarding female captives were particularly revolutionary. Rape was forbidden, punishable by death. If a pirate wished to take a captive as his wife, he had to be faithful to her. Any infidelity was, again, punishable by death. This code wasn't about morality, it was about discipline and business. By protecting villagers, she ensured a steady supply of food and intelligence. By centralizing the distribution of loot, all plunder had to be registered before being doled out. She prevented infighting and funded her massive operation. And by strictly regulating the treatment of women, she maintained order and discipline in a testosterone-fueled environment of thousands of hardened criminals. She was running the Red Flag Fleet, not like a chaotic band of thieves, but like a Fortune 500 company with a navy. The first thing you do is swear the sacramentum. This is the sacred oath binding you to the emperor and the eagle standards of your legion. You swear to obey every command without question, and to never desert, even in the face of certain death. It's less of a contract and more of a spiritual and legal chain around your neck for the next 25 years. At its zenith, Zheng Yi Sao's Red Flag Fleet was a staggering force. It comprised over 800 ships and somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 pirates. To put that in perspective, this single pirate fleet was larger than the entire Spanish Armada. It wasn't just a nuisance, it was a regional superpower. They controlled the entire Guangdong coastline, imposing taxes on coastal villages and levying a protection fee on any merchant ship that wanted to pass through their waters. To refuse was to have your ship plundered and your crew captured. They had effectively replaced the imperial government as the ruling authority of the South China Sea. The Qing government, deeply embarrassed and increasingly desperate, launched several massive naval campaigns to eradicate her. They failed, spectacularly. Zheng Yisao's fleet consistently outmaneuvered, outfought, and utterly humiliated the Imperial Navy. Her ships were faster, her captains more experienced, and her tactics more cunning. In one famous engagement, she cornered a provincial fleet and captured 63 of their ships, incorporating them into her own armada. The government's failure was so total that they were forced to resort to hiring foreign mercenaries, enlisting the help of the British and Portuguese navies. Even this coalition of empires struggled to make a dent in her power. While the Western ships had superior firepower, Zheng Yisao's fleet had the advantage of numbers and intimate knowledge of the coastal waters. They would use their smaller, faster junks to swarm larger vessels, turning battles into chaotic, close-quarters affairs where cannons were less effective. For years, she fought the combined might of 3 navies to a standstill. But she was also a realist. She knew that this couldn't last forever. The constant warfare was taking a toll, and the government's blockade was beginning to strain her supply lines. So in 1810, at the absolute height of her power, Zheng Yisao decided to do the one thing no one expected. She negotiated her own surrender. But this wasn't a capitulation. It was a retirement plan. She sailed, unarmed and accompanied only by a delegation of women and children, directly into the office of the Governor-General in Canton. She bypassed the humiliated military commanders and negotiated directly with the highest authority. She drove a hard bargain, and because the government was so desperate for a victory, any victory, they largely gave her everything she wanted. The terms of the pardon were astonishing. She demanded that she and her men be allowed to keep all the plunder they had accumulated over the years. She demanded that a significant number of her pirates be integrated into the Qing bureaucracy and military, essentially getting them government jobs. And, most audaciously, she demanded that her partner, Cheng Po-tsai, be given command of his own squadron within the Qing Navy. The Governor-General, with little choice, agreed to almost everything. Zheng Yisao had successfully negotiated a full pardon and a comfortable retirement for herself and thousands of her followers. And so, the most successful pirate in history simply walked away from the business. She married Cheng Po-tsai, who became a respectable military official. She kept her vast fortune and settled back in Guangdong, the very province she once terrorized. She used her wealth to open and operate a large and successful gambling house, a return of sorts to her roots in the entertainment and vice trade, but this time as the owner. She lived out the rest of her days in peace and prosperity, dying in 1844 at the age of 69, a wealthy and respected, or at least feared, matriarch. The story of Zheng Yisao is a remarkable testament to what a determined individual can achieve against impossible odds. She was a woman in a man's world, a commoner who defied an empire, a criminal who ended her career as a member of the establishment. She wasn't a hero in any traditional sense. Her wealth was built on violence and extortion, but her genius for strategy, administration, and negotiation is undeniable. She played the game of power better than the emperors and admirals sent to stop her, and in the end, she won. Let's now shift our focus from the grand stage of empires and pirate fleets to something much smaller, more delicate, and, for a time, infinitely more valuable. We're going to explore the strange and fascinating history of a flower, the tulip. Today, it's a common, cheerful sign of spring, available for a few dollars at any grocery store. But in the 17th century, this simple flower was the object of a speculative frenzy so intense that it drove the Dutch economy to the brink of collapse and turned single flower bulbs into assets more valuable than houses. It's a story about beauty, desire, and the madness of crowds. The tulip story doesn't begin in the Netherlands, but far to the east, in the gardens of the Ottoman Empire. Originally a wildflower from the mountains of Central Asia, it was cultivated and celebrated by the Turks for centuries. The word tulip itself is thought to derive from the Persian word for turban, which the flower's shape was said to resemble. In the court of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the tulip was a cherished symbol of wealth, power, and divine beauty. An entire festival, a tulip time, was dedicated to it, and the most prized varieties were subjects of poetry and art. It was a flower deeply woven into the fabric of Ottoman high culture. In the mid-16th century, the tulip made its way to Europe. The ambassador of the Holy Roman Emperor to the Sultan's court, a man named Ogier de Busbecq, was enchanted by the flowers he saw in Turkish gardens. He sent a few bulbs and seeds back to Vienna, where they were cultivated by the renowned botanist Carolus Clusius. When Clusius later took a position at Leiden University in the Netherlands, he brought his collection of tulips with him, planting them in the university's botanical garden. These were not for sale, they were for scientific study. But the beauty of the flowers, so different from anything the Dutch had seen before, quickly attracted attention. Then you're issued your gear. The famous armor, the Lorica segmentata, looks impressive, but it's a heavy, clanking cage of metal strips and leather straps. It chafes, it rusts, and in the heat of Syria or the damp cold of Britain, it becomes your personal, wearable torture device. The Dutch Republic in the early 17th century was experiencing its golden age. It was a global hub of trade, finance, and art, and a new class of wealthy merchants was emerging, eager to display their prosperity. Exotic goods from around the world were the ultimate status symbols, and the tulip, with its intense colors and elegant form, was the most exotic and desirable of them all. People began to covet the rare bulbs in Clusius's garden, and soon some were stolen and began to circulate among a small group of wealthy connoisseurs and dedicated growers, setting the stage for what was to come. What made tulips particularly ripe for a speculative bubble was their biology. Growing a tulip from seed to a flowering bulb takes 7 to 12 years. However, a mature bulb will produce not only a flower, but also several smaller offset bulbs or clones. These could be cultivated to produce flowers much more quickly. But the most prized tulips of all were the broken tulips. These were bulbs that produced flowers with stunning, flame-like streaks and feathered patterns of multiple colors. Today, we know this effect is caused by a virus, the tulip-breaking virus, which infects the bulb and disrupts its color pigmentation. In the 17th century, nobody knew about viruses. The beautiful, chaotic patterns seemed like a mysterious and wonderful act of nature, making these broken bulbs incredibly rare and desirable. You couldn't breed them intentionally. A plain bulb might randomly break one year, producing a spectacular new variety, while the offspring of a prized broken bulb might revert to a plain, single color. This unpredictability and rarity made them the ultimate luxury item. Famous varieties were given grand names, like Semper Augustus with its blood-red flames on a white background, or Viceroy with its purple and white feathers. By the 1630s, the passion for tulips, once the hobby of a few wealthy elites, had spread to the general populace. Merchants, artisans, and even servants began to speculate on the tulip market. The prices for rare bulbs began to skyrocket. A single bulb of a desirable variety could be traded for acres of land, a fine carriage, or a herd of livestock. The market became increasingly abstract. People weren't buying the bulbs to plant them. They were buying them with the expectation that the price would continue to rise and they could sell them for a profit. The flower itself became irrelevant. Only its potential resale value mattered. To facilitate this trade, a sophisticated futures market developed. Contracts were drawn up to buy bulbs at the end of the season for a set price. This allowed people to trade in tulips, even when the bulbs were still in the ground. The trade moved from the growers' gardens into the back rooms of taverns, where speculators would gather to buy and sell tulip contracts over drinks. It became a frantic, nationwide obsession. Stories abounded of people selling their homes, their family businesses, and their life savings to invest in a handful of what were, essentially, glorified onions. The peak of this tulip mania occurred in the winter of 1636 to 1637. Prices reached astronomical levels. A single bulb of the legendary Semper Augustus was said to be worth more than a grand townhouse on the Amsterdam canals. At one auction, a single Viceroy bulb was sold for a package of goods that included 2 loads of wheat, 4 loads of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 tons of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver beaker. The collective delusion had reached its absolute apex. And then, inevitably, the bubble burst. In February of 1637, at a routine bulb auction in the city of Haarlem, for the first time there were no buyers. The prices had become so ludicrously disconnected from any underlying reality that confidence simply evaporated overnight. Panic set in. Everyone rushed to sell their bulbs and contracts, but no one was buying. Prices plummeted, falling by over 90% in a matter of weeks. Fortunes were wiped out. People who had been paper millionaires one day found themselves holding worthless promissory notes and a few flower bulbs the next. The aftermath was a messy legal and financial crisis. Many people were contractually obligated to buy bulbs at prices that were now 10 times their market value. They refused to pay, leading to a wave of defaults and lawsuits. The Dutch government, trying to restore order, essentially voided most of the futures contracts, ruling that they were gambling debts and therefore unenforceable. While modern historians debate the extent of the economic damage, it probably didn't cause a full-blown depression as once thought. It was a severe shock and a profound psychological blow to the nation. It became a cautionary tale about greed and the folly of crowds. After the crash, the tulip did not disappear. It simply returned to being what it always was, a flower. The Dutch continued to cultivate and hybridize tulips, not as speculative assets, but for their beauty. They became masters of horticulture, and the Netherlands remains the world's center for tulip production to this day, exporting billions of bulbs every year. The fields of colorful tulips that bloom across the Dutch countryside each spring are a direct legacy of this strange and feverish period of their history. The mania was gone, but the love for the flower itself endured. The story of tulip mania has become a classic parable in economics, often cited as the first major example of a speculative asset bubble. It's a timeless story because it reveals a fundamental aspect of human psychology, our capacity for collective belief to create value out of thin air, and how quickly that belief can vanish. It shows how desire, status, and the fear of missing out can overwhelm rational thought, turning a simple, beautiful flower into a vehicle for wild speculation and, ultimately, financial ruin. It's a quiet reminder that the line between value and delusion can sometimes be as thin and fragile as a petal. Your helmet, the galea, offers decent protection but severely limits your peripheral vision and hearing, turning the battlefield into a confusing tunnel of noise and chaos. Your shield, the towering scutum, is a 4-foot-tall plank of wood and leather that feels like you're carrying a door into battle. From the ephemeral value of flowers, let's now turn to something more solid, yet equally imbued with human ambition and mystery: the lost city of Petra. Carved directly into the sheer, rose-colored rock faces of a remote desert canyon in what is now modern-day Jordan, Petra is a breathtaking testament to the ingenuity of an ancient people. It wasn't just a city, it was a nexus of trade, a fortress of commerce hidden away from the world. Its story is one of mastering a hostile environment and building an empire of wealth not on conquest, but on control of a precious resource: incense. The architects of this magnificent city were the Nabateans, a nomadic Arab tribe who began to settle in the region around the 4th century BCE. They were masters of the desert, and they possessed a skill that was more valuable than gold in this arid landscape: water management. They developed an incredibly sophisticated system of dams, cisterns, and channels, carved into the rock to capture and store every drop of precious rainwater. This allowed them to not only sustain a large population in the middle of the desert, but also to create lush gardens, turning their hidden valley into a vibrant oasis. Their control of water gave them control of trade. Petra was perfectly situated at the crossroads of ancient caravan routes that carried frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia to the ports of the Mediterranean. These aromatic resins were immensely valuable in the ancient world, used in religious ceremonies, perfumes, and medicine by the Romans, Greeks, and Egyptians. The Nabateans became the essential middlemen. They offered weary caravans a safe place to rest, replenish their water, and trade their goods, all for a hefty fee. They built their wealth by being the desert's indispensable toll collectors. As their wealth grew, the Nabateans began to transform their capital from a simple settlement into a stunning necropolis and commercial center. Instead of building with stone, they carved their most important structures directly out of the sandstone cliffs. This unique architectural style served a dual purpose. It was incredibly durable, and the dramatic, rock-hewn facades were an awe-inspiring display of their power and prosperity to visiting traders. The city itself was a work of art, designed to impress and intimidate. The journey into Petra is an experience in itself, designed by the Nabateans to be dramatic. You enter through the Seek, a narrow, winding canyon over a kilometer long, with towering cliffs that blot out the sky. The path twists and turns, building a sense of anticipation. And then, As you round the final bend, you are confronted with the city's most iconic monument, the Al-Khazne, or the Treasury. Its magnificent Hellenistic facade, with its intricate columns and sculptures, is carved with breathtaking precision from the pink sandstone, a startling vision of civilization emerging from the raw rock. Despite its name, the treasury was not a treasury at all. It was most likely a tomb for a Nabatean king. The name comes from a Bedouin legend that an Egyptian pharaoh hid his treasure in the stone urn at the very top of the facade. Bullet marks from centuries of hopeful treasure hunters still pockmark the urn. The treasury is just the beginning. The canyon opens up into a wider valley, revealing a vast city of tombs, temples, theaters, and houses, all carved into the surrounding cliffs. There's a colossal Roman-style theater that could seat thousands, and a monastery perched high on a mountaintop, requiring a strenuous climb up 800 rock-cut steps. For centuries, Petra thrived. The Nabateans absorbed cultural influences from all the peoples they traded with, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Assyrian, and blended them into their own unique art and architecture. They were a cosmopolitan and sophisticated people. However, their fiercely guarded independence couldn't last forever. In 106 CE, the ever-expanding Roman Empire, eager to control the lucrative incense trade directly, annexed the Nabatean kingdom without a fight. Petra became the capital of the Roman province of Arabia Petraea. Under Roman rule, the city continued to prosper for a time. The Romans added to the city's infrastructure, paving the main colonnaded street and expanding the theater. But the tide of history was turning against Petra. New maritime trade routes, particularly through the Red Sea and up the Nile, began to bypass the old overland caravan trails. The city's primary source of wealth, its control over land-based trade, began to dry up. It slowly lost its strategic importance and began a long, quiet decline. The final blow came not from man, but from nature. In 363 CE, a massive earthquake struck the region, toppling many of the city's freestanding structures and, crucially, destroying its intricate water management system. Rebuilding such a complex network was beyond the means of the city's dwindling population. Without its lifeblood of water, life in Petra became unsustainable. The city was gradually abandoned, left to the desert sands and the local Bedouin tribes who used the cool, empty tombs as shelters for themselves and their goats. For over 1,000 years, Petra was effectively lost to the Western world. It became a place of legend, its location a closely guarded secret by the local tribes. It wasn't until 1812 that a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, disguised as an Arab scholar, tricked a local guide into leading him to the mythical lost city. His rediscovery, and the stunning drawings and accounts he brought back to Europe, ignited the world's imagination. Petra became a symbol of romantic adventure and forgotten grandeur, the rose-red city half as old as time. Your main weapons are the pilum and the gladius. The pilum is a heavy javelin designed to be thrown once to disrupt the enemy line. Your gladius is a short, stubby sword. It's not for elegant dueling. It's a brutal tool for stabbing and thrusting in the crush of close-quarters combat. Efficient, yes. Heroic, not so much. Today, Petra is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and Jordan's most famous attraction. But walking through its silent, monumental canyons, you can still feel the presence of the Nabateans. You can see the channels they carved to guide water, the tombs they sculpted for their kings, and the niches they cut for their gods. It stands as a powerful reminder that even the most ingenious and wealthy civilizations can be undone by forces beyond their control, a shift in trade, a tremor in the earth. Petra is a city built on a paradox, carved from eternal rock, yet ultimately as transient as the caravans that once gave it life. From a city lost in the desert, let's journey back in time and across continents, to a single pivotal year that seemed to encapsulate the chaos and cruelty of its era. We're going to explore the year 536 CE, a year that some historians and climate scientists have called the single worst year to be alive in all of human history. It wasn't a year of a great war or a singular plague, but something far more insidious and terrifying, a sudden, catastrophic, and mysterious climate event that plunged much of the northern hemisphere into darkness, cold, and famine for over a decade. It began with a fog, a strange, persistent, and dense dry fog that rolled across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. The Byzantine historian Procopius, writing in Constantinople, described it vividly. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. He noted that the sun's light was dim, as if it were in a constant state of eclipse. This wasn't a normal fog that would burn off by midday. It was a veil in the upper atmosphere that lingered for 18 months, blocking out the sun, stunting crops, and chilling the world to the bone. The immediate effect was a dramatic drop in temperature. Summer temperatures in 536 fell by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius, triggering the coldest decade in the past 300 years. There was summer frost in Europe. In China, there was snow in August. The lack of sunlight and the sudden cold caused catastrophic crop failures across the northern hemisphere. The Irish chronicles record a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. In Mesopotamia, the once fertile plains were hit with out-of-season snow and frost, leading to widespread famine. The very rhythm of life, dictated by the seasons and the sun, had been broken. For centuries, the cause of this mystery veil was unknown. Contemporary writers had no explanation. They saw it as a terrible omen, a sign of divine displeasure. But modern science has provided a likely culprit. By analyzing ice cores from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, scientists can read the history of the atmosphere. In layers corresponding to the year 536, they found a thick deposit of volcanic sulfate particles. This points to a massive volcanic eruption, or possibly a series of eruptions, that ejected a colossal amount of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. The leading theory points to a massive eruption somewhere in the northern hemisphere, likely in Iceland or North America. The fine ash and sulfates would have formed a dense aerosol veil that circled the globe, reflecting sunlight back into space and causing a, quote, volcanic winter. The scale of this event would have been immense, far larger than any eruption in modern recorded history, like Krakatoa or Pinatubo. It was a planetary-scale climate catastrophe that happened with absolutely no warning, plunging the world into a state of cold, dark confusion. The social and political consequences of this climate shock were profound. Widespread famine led to malnutrition, social unrest, and mass migration as desperate people abandoned their dead fields in search of food. Economies, which were almost entirely agrarian, collapsed. In the chaos and weakness that followed, societies became far more vulnerable to disease. The weakened, starving populations of the Mediterranean world were the perfect kindling for the disaster that was to follow just a few years later. In 541 CE, just as the world was beginning to recover from the worst of the cold and darkness, the first wave of the bubonic plague arrived in the Byzantine Empire. This pandemic, known as the Plague of Justinian, was one of the deadliest in human history. It swept through the weakened, hungry populations, killing an estimated third to a half of the people in the territories it touched. It's impossible to separate this plague from the climate event that preceded it. The famine of 536 had created the perfect storm, a world of immunologically compromised people, ripe for a devastating pandemic. The bad year had become a catastrophic generation. The year 536 and the decade that followed can be seen as a great turning point, a dark hinge in history. It helped to hasten the final collapse of the last vestiges of the Western Roman Empire. It crippled the Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Justinian, thwarting his attempts to reconquer the lost Western provinces. It caused political upheaval in China and triggered migrations across Central Asia that would reshape the continent. It was a moment when the engine of civilization seemed to sputter and stall, choked by a mysterious cloud from a volcano half a world away. Imagine the psychological terror of living through that time. Your world, once predictable, is suddenly thrown into a dim, cold twilight. The sun is a pale, powerless disk in the sky. Your crops fail, your children are hungry, and no one knows why. It would have felt truly apocalyptic, the end of the world. It's a stark reminder of how utterly dependent human civilization is on a stable climate, and how a single random event in the Earth's geological systems can bring even the most powerful empires to their knees. It wasn't just the worst year to be alive. It was the beginning of a long, dark age. But the gear doesn't stop there. You are also issued your sarcina, your marching pack. This contains your bedding, a cooking pot, digging tools like a shovel and pickaxe, your rations for several days, and any personal items. All told, you are carrying between 80 and 100 pounds of equipment every single day. Leaving behind that bleak and chilling year, let's now delve into the life of an individual whose story is a complex tapestry of faith, madness, and immense political power. We're going to examine the life of Juana of Castile, a Spanish queen who is known to history by a rather unflattering and tragic nickname, Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Her story is a heartbreaking tale of a woman caught in the crossfire of dynastic ambition, a pawn in the games of her father, her husband, and her son, whose grief and passion were used as a weapon to disinherit her from her rightful throne. Juana was born in 1479, the daughter of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, the famous Catholic monarchs who unified Spain, completed the Reconquista, and funded the voyages of Christopher Columbus. Juana was a highly intelligent and well-educated princess, fluent in multiple languages and skilled in music, but from an early age. She also showed signs of what was then described as a deep melancholy and a fervent, almost obsessive, religious piety, traits that would later be twisted and used against her. As a princess, her primary role was to be a tool of her parents' foreign policy. In 1496, she was sent to Flanders to marry Philip, the Duke of Burgundy, known as Philip the Handsome. The marriage was designed to forge a powerful alliance against France. What her parents didn't count on was that Juana would fall desperately and passionately in love with her charismatic and notoriously unfaithful husband. Their relationship was a volatile storm of intense love, jealousy, and public arguments. Juana's devotion to Philip was all-consuming, and his constant philandering caused her immense distress, leading to public scenes and fits of rage that began to build a reputation for instability. Juana was never supposed to be queen. She had an older brother, John, and an older sister, Isabella, who were ahead of her in the line of succession. But a series of tragic and unexpected deaths changed everything. Her brother died, then her sister died, and then her sister's young son also died. Suddenly, this passionate, volatile princess who had been sent abroad was now the heir to the vast kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. This was not a welcome development for the powerful men in her life, particularly her father Ferdinand and her husband Philip. When her mother, Queen Isabella, died in 1504, Juana became Queen of Castile, but her will contained a troubling clause. It stated that if Juana was unwilling or unable to rule, her father Ferdinand should govern in her name. This was the opening both Ferdinand and Philip needed. They immediately began a power struggle over who would control Castile, with the supposedly mad Juana as the prize. Philip, wanting to rule himself, tried to portray his wife as competent but easily influenced. Ferdinand, on the other hand, began a more aggressive campaign to paint his own daughter as mentally unfit to govern, spreading rumors of her erratic behavior. The situation came to a head in 1506 when Juana and Philip sailed to Spain to claim her throne. Philip managed to outmaneuver his father-in-law and was recognized as King of Castile, ruling jointly with Juana. But his triumph was short-lived. Just a few months later, Philip the Handsome fell ill with a fever, likely typhoid, and died suddenly at the age of 28. Juana, who was pregnant with their sixth child, was completely and utterly devastated. Her profound grief would become the central exhibit in the case for her madness. Juana refused to let Philip's body be buried. For months, she led a bizarre funeral procession that wandered through the Castilian countryside, traveling only at night because, she said, a widow who has lost the son of her own soul should not be seen in the light of day. She would frequently have the casket opened so she could look upon her husband's embalmed face. These actions, born of a deep pathological grief, were seen by her contemporaries, and especially by her father, as definitive proof of her insanity. It was the perfect pretext to seize power. Her father, Ferdinand, finally intervened. He returned to Castile, declared his daughter mentally incapacitated, and had her confined to the royal convent of Santa Clara in the remote town of Tordesillas. He then assumed full control of the government, ruling as regent in her name. Juana, the rightful Queen of Castile, became a prisoner, separated from most of her children and locked away from the world. Her title remained, but her power was gone. She was a queen in name only, a ghost haunting the Spanish monarchy. For the next decade, Juana remained imprisoned in Tordesillas. When her father Ferdinand died in 1516, Her own son, the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, arrived in Spain to claim the throne. He met with his mother, but he had no intention of freeing her. He saw her, just as his grandfather had, as a political liability. He renewed her imprisonment, keeping her locked away while he ruled Spain in her name. For Charles, her confinement was essential. As long as she lived, she was a potential rallying point for nobles who might want to challenge his rule. There was one brief, violent attempt to liberate her. In 1520, a popular uprising known as the Revolt of the Comuneros broke out against Charles's rule. The rebels captured Tordesillas and tried to persuade Juana to sign a document declaring her support for their cause. Had she done so, it might have changed the course of Spanish history. But after decades of confinement, she refused. Whether out of loyalty to her son, a deep sense of royal legitimacy, or simply a state of mental detachment, she would not act against her family. The revolt was eventually crushed, and with it, any hope of her freedom. And now, you march. And march. And march. You'll cover 20 miles on a good day, in all weather, over rough terrain. Your feet, clad in hobnailed sandals called calage, will be a constant landscape of blisters, cuts, and aches. This is why the common soldier was nicknamed Marius's Mule. Juana would spend a total of 46 years imprisoned in that dreary convent in Tordesillas. She was often neglected by her keepers, and her mental and physical health deteriorated over the long, empty decades. She died in 1555, just a year before her son Charles V himself abdicated his throne. She had been the technical queen of Spain for half a century, yet she had ruled for none of it. She outlived her parents, her husband, and most of her siblings, but her life was one defined by loss, manipulation, and imprisonment. Was Juana truly mad? It's a question modern historians still debate. She certainly suffered from what we would today likely diagnose as severe clinical depression or another mental illness, triggered and exacerbated by her husband's death. But it is also undeniable that her condition was deliberately exaggerated and exploited by her father, husband, and son for their own political gain. She was a woman of intense emotions in an age that had no framework for understanding them, and her passion was weaponized to strip her of her birthright. Her story is not just one of madness, but of the brutal politics of power and the tragic fate of a queen who loved too much. From the gilded prison of a Spanish queen, let's now travel to the frozen, unforgiving landscape of the Antarctic, and to a story of survival that stands as one of the most incredible epics of human endurance ever recorded. We're going to recount the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition of 1914 and the story of its leader, Sir Ernest Shackleton, and his crew. Their goal was audacious: to be the first to cross the Antarctic continent on foot. They failed in that goal, but in their failure they achieved something far greater. A 2-year ordeal of survival against impossible odds without losing a single man. The expedition set sail from England in August 1914, on the cusp of the First World War, aboard a sturdy 3-masted ship named, with a great deal of hope, the Endurance. Shackleton was a veteran of the Antarctic, having previously come within 100 miles of the South Pole. This new expedition was to be his crowning achievement. After a stop in South Georgia, a remote whaling station in the South Atlantic, they headed for the Weddell Sea, the icy gateway to the continent. Shackleton knew the risks of the pack ice, but he was confident his ship was strong enough to push through. The Weddell Sea proved to be far more treacherous than anticipated. The ice was unusually thick that year. By January 1915, just 1 day's sail from their intended landing site, the Endurance became trapped, frozen like an almond in a chocolate bar, as one crewman put it. At first, they were optimistic, hoping that the seasonal drift of the ice would eventually free them. But as the weeks turned into months, and the long, dark Antarctic winter set in, they realized they were helpless prisoners of the ice pack, drifting aimlessly with the frozen sea. For 10 months, the 28 men of the expedition lived aboard the trapped ship. They maintained a strict routine of chores, scientific observations, and recreation to keep up morale. They played football on the ice and raced their dog teams. But all the while, the immense pressure of the shifting ice floes was slowly, inexorably crushing their ship. The sound of the Endurance's timbers groaning and cracking became the constant, terrifying soundtrack of their lives. In October 1915, the pressure became too much. The ship's hull was breached, and Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. They set up a makeshift camp on the ice, which they named Patience Camp. They had managed to salvage 3 of the ship's lifeboats and as many supplies as they could carry before the Endurance finally broke apart and sank beneath the ice in November. They watched their last link to the outside world disappear, leaving them stranded on a floating sheet of ice, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, with no hope of rescue. All they had were 3 small boats, their sled dogs, and Shackleton's unwavering leadership. His mission was no longer about exploration, it was about getting every single one of his men home alive. For 5 more months, they drifted on the ice floe, their world shrinking as the ice began to break up beneath them with the coming of the Antarctic summer. Finally, in April 1916, the floe they were on fractured, and they were forced to take to the open, stormy sea in their 3 small lifeboats. For 5 harrowing days, they rode through icy waters, dodging massive icebergs, soaked to the bone and suffering from frostbite and thirst. They were aiming for Elephant Island, a desolate, uninhabited shard of rock and ice on the very edge of the Antarctic Peninsula. Miraculously, all 3 boats made it. They landed on Elephant Island, the first time they had stood on solid ground in 497 days. But their ordeal was far from over. Elephant Island was a barren, storm-lashed rock, far from any shipping lanes. No one would ever find them there by chance. It was a temporary refuge, not a rescue. Shackleton knew that if they were to survive, he would have to go for help. He made a decision of almost unimaginable audacity. He would take one of the lifeboats, the 22-foot James Caird, and attempt to sail 800 miles across the most violent stretch of ocean on the planet, the Drake Passage, to the whaling stations of South Georgia. He chose 5 of his strongest men to go with him. The remaining 22 men were left behind on Elephant Island under the command of his second, Frank Wild, with instructions to survive as best they could. They turned the 2 remaining lifeboats upside down to create a makeshift shelter and prepared for a long, desperate wait.